You're listening to the Quint's podcast.
Welcome to Season 2 of the Quint Fortnightly podcast, Land of a Billion. We aim to bring you expert conversations about the most contentious of the holy roti kapda makan trinity, that is, the makan over our heads and the larger ecosystem that governs it. This podcast is produced in association with the Property Rights Research Consortium, supported by Umidya Network India. I'm Bhargavi, a researcher interested in land and access to finance, and your host for this season. Urban population in India is growing at a rapid pace. As of 2011, conservative estimates suggest that 30% of India's population lives in cities. More realistic estimates put it anywhere between 47 to 50% of India's population living in cities. Now, this suggests that the demand for housing in cities is likely to be high, and it will be difficult to find vacant houses in Indian cities. However, that's not true. Research actually suggests that quite a few houses in India's cities are actually vacant. Now, this in turn would suggest that rental yields in India are fantastic. Why? Because there's high demand, high vacancy, and that implies a scarcity in housing. And in an economist's terms, this pushes up rents. Now, that's not true either. Rental yields in India are amongst the lowest in the world. Rental yields are in the range of 2 to 3%. Just for some perspective, rental yields in a city like Dubai are in the range of 7 to 8%. So, what is going on here? Many people believe that India's rental housing market is messed up because of rent controls. What is rent control? Rent control laws essentially cap the amount of rent that tenants have to pay to landlords and hugely restrict the grounds on which tenants can be evicted by landlords. So they make it really hard for landlords to get their houses back. Now, in response to this problem, the cabinet in 2021 approved a model tenancy law. And they believe that this will solve some of the problems of the rental housing market in India. What does a model tenancy law do? It gives some respite to tenants by providing for written agreements, capping security deposit, and so on. It provides some respite to landlords by rationalizing the grounds on which landlords can evict tenants for defaulting behavior. And it gives some respite to courts by setting up a separate quasi-judicial dispute resolution mechanism. To what extent can this puzzle of high demand, high vacancy, but still low rental yields in India's cities be resolved by the Model Tenancy Act? To answer this question, we have with us two guests, Sahil Gandhi, who's an urban economist. He's currently a lecturer at the University of Manchester. Until recently, he was a researcher associated with the Center for Social and Economic Progress. We also have with us Mr. Gautam Chatterjee, who was the chairperson of the Maharashtra Real Estate Regulatory and Development Authority. Mr. Chatterjee has worked extensively on issues like affordable housing, slum rehabilitation, and urban development in the state of Maharashtra. Welcome, Sahil and Mr. Chatterjee, to the Land of a Billion podcast.
Thank you, Bhargavi.
Thank you for having us, Bhargavi.
Sure. So let's begin with identifying some of the key challenges in the rental housing market in India. So, Sahil, you have worked a lot on the high rates of urban vacancy. What do you think are the factors contributing to this, and what effects does high vacancy have on the housing market in India's cities?
Right. So, Bhargavi, you summarized the whole problem really well. A rental housing market is actually a key for a growing economy. It encourages labor mobility and migration. But what has happened over the last 5 decades is that rental housing stock has fallen. Actually, the share of rental housing has fallen from 53% in 1961 to around 25% in 2011. Now, economist Asser Lindbeck stated that rent control appears to be the most efficient technique presently known to destroy a city. And that is what's happened in India. We've had stringent rent control in several states in India, which has destroyed rental housing. Landlords are totally disincentivized to rent out, and this has made cities quite unaffordable to live. Now, given this, we have a massive housing shortage. Like there are several millions of people living in slums. That number is approximately 17% of urban households living in slums. We also have 12% of our housing stock that is vacant. Now, this was a puzzle to me. Like, why is it that landlords are not renting out? Now, at CSEP, the Center for Social and Economic Progress, along with Professor Richard Green, who is an urban economist at the University of Southern California, and Shauli Patranabis, who right now is a doctoral student at the London School of Economics, we went into this question of why there is so much vacancy in Indian cities. Now, one of the reasons that we know is that, as you mentioned, Bhargavi, is that the rental yields are extremely low in some of the cities in India. Now, on average, the rental yields are between 2 to 4% given the city that you're in. So the returns are extremely low for renting out. The risks are extremely high. So the risk adjusted return is even lower. Now, these risks come from the fact that there are severe rent controls and the judicial capacity is quite weak. So our paper finds that states that moved from a pro-tenant rent control act to a pro-landlord rent control act actually reduced vacancy rates. We also find that districts with better judicial capacity have lower vacancy. So I believe that the new Model Tenancy Act is addressing these risks, and hopefully vacancy rates would fall once the states adopt the Model Tenancy Act.
But I wanted to understand from Mr. Chatterjee. Mr. Chatterjee has seen this up close, having been at RERA and having seen redevelopment projects. What are your views on the Model Tenancy Act, and do you think they can solve the problems of a city like Bombay?
Well, Bhargavi and Sahil, I think both of you have captured the whole essence of the present situation, housing situation in Mumbai quite well. The major problem that we find today in rental housing emerges from the fact that the government has always approached this issue of housing shortage, or public housing to the urban poor, by focusing on providing them with ownership housing, or for that matter, land titles. If you go back to maybe the mid 80s, when we had the World Bank aided slum upgradation program, there too the whole issue was that we have to provide tenure to the people who are staying in informal settlements. So wherever tenure can be given in situ, people should be formed into cooperative societies and long-term tenure has to be given. People who had to be moved out were to be provided sites and services. They are 10 by 15 feet, 150 square feet area. But all this was towards ownership. There was no concept of actually giving anything which will be on a rental basis. Nowhere the concept of rental was there. Now, when the state was looking at all this solution to the housing problem from the perspective of everything is ownership, the actual formal or the informal market, especially the informal market, was not looking at from the same lens. In the informal sector, you had slumlords who were giving out these structures on rent. You had people who were staying in the ground floor of a slum structure, was creating a mezzanine floor because the government over a period of time, the municipal corporation, allowed a slum structure to go up to 14 feet. So the upper 6 feet was actually a mezzanine floor, which in about 30 to 35% of the cases was being given on rent. So actually in that slum, the owner of the slum structure was staying in the ground floor and giving out the mezzanine floor on rent, and also maybe earning some rent out of that structure. So informally, in the slums, we had a large number of people who could find place to go and stay. So the migrant population who were moving in here is not that they were trying to go and then there was some land available, they'll go and just encroach upon the land and stay there. They would have to go through the slumlords, also maybe the lower echelons of the police or the housing board officials or the municipal corporation officials, or even maybe the political leaders at the lower level, who would facilitate his getting into a structure where he will pay money. He may have to pay money, which is not only rent, but also a lump sum money, which will be a money as a security deposit. So everything that you talk about today in maybe the Model Tenancy Act, or has been talked about in the Leave-in license arrangement which existed after 1999, of having a certain amount of rent and certain amount of security deposit, was very much existing in the informal sector and continues to exist. And sometimes I feel that in the slum rehabilitation, though we talk about rehabilitation, it actually also is displacement. Because people who stay in these rentals in the mezzanine floor, they never get to access become a beneficiary in the slum rehabilitation program, because they get thrown out. So therefore, this has been the real scenario in which the whole housing scenario has developed. This is the backdrop in which we are actually dealing with the present housing situation. And therefore, one would eagerly look forward to something like the Model Tenancy Act being adopted in Maharashtra, in Mumbai, so that we can come out of this situation. Of course, the Model Tenancy Act will also have to be looked upon, along with how do we scale up, bringing in more affordable rental housing by implementing properly the affordable rental housing scheme of the Government of India.
No, that's fantastic, Mr. Chatterjee. Thanks a lot. So, just a couple of thoughts as you were speaking, which came to mind. And Sahil, just feel free to jump in whenever you think, I missed a point. The first point that you made is very interesting, which is home ownership versus tenancy. And it's not just India, right? All over the world, we see home ownership as a major sort of promise that is made by governments all over the world. And I wonder if, that has got something to do with inherently what humans want, which is that they want a permanent home in their lives. And especially in a country where tenure security is not so sure, you'll have to go to court if you're evicted unfairly and so on and so forth, and you're not sure how that will pan out. And the lack of focus on tenancy. Now, as we speak, until very recently, Germany was sort of touted as this country where most people actually rent homes and don't really own homes. And owning home was, not fashionable. And, the young generation always prefer to rent over own. And, just yesterday, last evening, I read a news item which said that the residents of the city of Berlin have actually voted on a referendum seeking expropriation of housing units in the city of Berlin, which are owned by large landlords. Okay, so something like the urban land ceiling concept, which is that if one or two landlords alone own all the housing units in the city, then the residents have indicated that they should be expropriated. And I wish I were there to tell them about the experience that Bombay or other cities in India have had with urban land ceiling, where you cap the amount of real estate, whether it be land or whether it be premises, etc. And that creates all sorts of skewed incentives, and it does not help the purpose of redistribution to begin with. And second, it does not help that it actually makes the state the largest landowner, because the expropriation happens in favor of the state, and the state then becomes the largest landowner. And the lack of focus instead on easing zoning, increasing incentives to build more affordable housing, which actually you mentioned happened only in the late 90s. So I know that Sahil has views on this. So, Sahil, would you like to chip in here?
Yeah, so Bombay has one of the most strictest land use regulations, and like it has one of the highest, the lowest FAR, the flow area ratio, or the flow space index, which has really curtailed housing supply. And one way to make housing more affordable is to ensure that markets provide more housing, and that has not happened. In fact, I don't know if Mr. Chatterjee was the secretary in the housing in Maharashtra, but Maharashtra wanted to repeal the Rent Control Act in 2015, and it was making it more pro landlord. But the greatest difficulty I believe Maharashtra faced in passing that amended Rent Control Act was because there was a lobbying done by South Mumbai owners who bought housing in through Pagdi, who were worried that despite paying Pagdi, they would lose the rental units. So I don't know if Mr. Chatterjee wants to say something about this whole issue, because I think that Rent Control Act was really really great, and it was unfortunate that it didn't pass through.
Well, two things before I come to the whole lobbying and the people who were opposed to the 1999 Rent Control Act, or the aspect of doing away with the standard rent, or taking those old buildings where the rents were frozen at 1940 level to be actually brought to the market rent level or not. So that's one aspect. But before going into that, I'll just come to the issue of what you mentioned about the FSI being the lowest. And also more land needs to be made available to the market forces to deliver. I have a little point of difference here, in the sense that providing land or making land available to the market will actually cater to only the middle class, upper middle class and above. If we are talking about the lower income group and the EWS, the economically weaker section of society, I'm afraid it will not be the private sector who will get into that sort of a thing. Of course, one I must mention here that after the whole issue of information asymmetry and the other problems of housing in the ownership sector was tackled through bringing in the RERA Act, we have seen that gradually the private sector also moving into creating ownership housing also for the 1 BHK, 2 BHK, the so-called affordable housing type, especially in the tier 2, tier 3 cities or maybe in the peripheral areas of the metropolitan region. So actually at one point of time when I was chairing Maharashtra, I found that about 60% of the housing that is coming into the market from the private sector owners, the private sector developers are these small houses. But then the land prices continue to be high, and therefore what actually happened is that the price of the house was less because the house size was coming down. But the other point was that if you actually are doing your duty as a sovereign municipal local body of doing a master plan for the city, you cannot merely say that yes, this much of land I actually devote to residential creation of residential housing and give maybe extra FSI and that will solve the problem. I'm afraid that's not going to happen unless you are able to earmark land within the residential zone also for affordable housing and maybe to add not only affordable ownership housing but affordable rental housing. It is not going to happen that you will have these lands which are in a mathematical calculation enough with the FSI that you give, even if higher FSI you give, to cater to everybody who resides in the city. You will have a situation where maybe the private sector will build there with the higher FSI, and you will have a situation as you have today in Mumbai that over 2 lakh houses are lying vacant. Now, that is not going to solve the housing problem. So if you are talking about the Tenancy Act, which actually brings maybe a level playing field for both the owners and the tenants, which actually takes away very restrictive things, which takes away this perception that a landowner has today that if I give out my house, then maybe the contract will not be implemented properly, contract conditions, and therefore I may lose the house. All these fear that they have, that will go away if you try to get the Model Tenancy Act suited to Maharashtra and bring it in, number one. Have the development plan in such a manner so that it not only reserves land for residential zoning, but reserves land also for the purpose of constructing housing which is affordable, both ownership and rented. Also tweaking the slum rehabilitation scheme to say that no, everything will not be ownership. There will be also rental housing created there. Because basically for all these schemes which are bringing in houses, whether through your state parastatals or through the planning authorities like the Slum Rehabilitation Authority or the Member Municipal Corporation who is doing the development plan, you will have to earmark specially land for the purpose of affordable housing and affordable rental housing, and then maybe start dovetailing that with the schemes that the government of India is coming up with, like the affordable housing scheme. Now, if the rental yields are 1 to 3%, then obviously, unless you do something which subsidize the capital cost of that rental house, it is not going to be affordable for the private sector to come in and build rented accommodation or rent tenanted buildings. But if suppose the yields are worked out in such a manner that they get 6 to 8%, as it was happening in the commercial segment, where we had private developers creating commercial tenements because they were getting an yield of about 6, 7, 8%. You have to also then have these lands where through maybe using the FSI, you cross-subsidize the land price and invite private sector to bring in and create large affordable rental housing scheme colonies, and then have a system by which you ensure that it actually goes to those people who are the most vulnerable in the city.
Okay, Sahil, you any views on this?
No, I'm in concurrence with what Mr. Chatterjee is saying. That is that private sector will not provide housing to the poor, and that's for sure. Like I don't think so. If you release FSI, the private sector will all of a sudden start building housing for the poor. But what would effectively happen is that the supply of housing for lower middle income or even upper middle income would go up. And currently, a lot of housing that is built in Mumbai is not affordable even to the middle income group. I believe that housing for the poor is definitely something that the state has to provide housing for. But what would happen if FSI is released, that the supply of housing for the middle income would go up. And so the point I'm trying to make here is that one would require a strategy such that you have the public sector taking care of housing for the poor, and at the same time you have a released FSI which would take care of housing for the middle income group.
No, I agree with you, Sahil, on that, but I still have little problem to accept that the state or the state parastatal will be have suddenly developed the capacity to deal with the large backlog that we have, to deal with the problem of the urban poor. So urban poor also,
Right.
let's not say that it is the homogeneous urban poor. There will be the poorest of the poor also, but then there are also the economically weaker section on the in the upper fringes and the lower income group. What I'm trying to say is that we will somehow have to create capacity also, and maybe force the private sector to come in and play this role to create housing also for these people who are in the lower income group.
Right.
Certainly, I agree with you that the middle class and others also, the prices will have to come down and make the things have to become affordable, and such policy tools of FSI and other things need to be used there. But what I'm again saying is that having worked in the housing board and seeing the capacity of the state, I don't think we can actually only say that the state will deliver through these state parastatals. So I'm again, to sum up, I'm saying that the state should play its role as a planning authority properly, where through the plans, because today you see this SRA was created as a planning authority, but it does no plan. It is actually there to only work as approving the private developers' proposals that come to them. They should have actually created the plan, which is a plan to account for all the 8 to 10 lakh households that are staying in the slums, to see in what manner and over what period of time and how, where the private sector will come in and where the private sector will stay away, and therefore what method has to be adopted to see that these people can get a proper house, which may not all be in the ownership segment, but then also maybe rental housing. But that has not happened. So planning is something which needs to be done either by the Mumbai Municipal Corporation or the SRA in a proper manner. Through the planning, you will create the land stock where, with restrictions, you will actually ask the private sector to come in, not to do just charity, but to come in and their capacity that is available with them, which is maybe lying idle, to be utilized to the fullest extent, so that they create this housing stock. And we have schemes to that effect. You have the affordable housing, rental housing scheme. Now, that will not see the light of the day unless all these things are looked at in totality. So that's the point I'm trying to make. State only depending on the state parastatal to solve this problem, unfortunately, I don't think is going to work.
No, I think that makes a lot of sense, Mr. Chatterjee. And I think there was this whole inclusionary housing scheme in Maharashtra, which is what you're mentioning, the rental
That's
housing.
right. 20% to be actually earmarked for that. Yeah.
I want to come back to the point of the model tenancy law, because that is the current topic that we are dealing with. And that is one, from what I understand from your conversation, it's one in an arsenal of tools that need to be used to fix the housing market problem in Bombay. So or in any other city in India. So just to come back, right now, the model tenancy law also, its timing is really peculiar because we are just coming out of the pandemic. And on the one hand, there will be people who would be rather disenchanted with the city and would leave the city and would probably go back to, maybe move back to tier 3 tier cities or something like that. And there will be people who will actually find the value of a home much more than what they used to find, because so much of work is happening from home. Sahil, do you think, as an economist, how does this play into the preferences of homeowners, and how do you think the model tenancy law intersects with that?
Right. No, and this has been a problem not just in India, it's been a problem all around the world, where people have lost livelihoods during the pandemic, and one just cannot pay rents or mortgages. In fact, the renters are one of the most vulnerable groups when it comes to a city, because the moment they lose jobs, they can't pay rents, and then they need to go back home. Now, there is a clause in the Model Tenancy Act, which is the force majeure clause, which basically says that if your contract is about to end during a calamity, then the landlord cannot evict you, like till the end of the calamity. But of course, the tenant has to continue paying rent during the calamity. Now, and these calamities are like, could be wars, floods, droughts. So I'm not sure if pandemic comes within a force majeure clause. Like, I would think that rationality would dictate that they would bring in the pandemic within a force majeure clause. Now, a lot of cities around the world have something called the rent moratorium, which basically means that during a pandemic, when your incomes fall, then you don't need to pay rent during the calamity, but the rent adds up, and at the end of the term, you will eventually have to pay rent back to the landlord. Now, that's something that's not there in the Rent Control Act. So I'm hoping that when states come out with their versions of the act, they would think about adding a rent moratorium. So I think that those are my thoughts on the Rent Control Act and the current situation.
Interesting. So, it's true that even our own central bank actually had waived payment of EMIs, etc., on cards and formal credit mechanisms, right? Whereas we don't know to what extent that really happened for operational debts like rents and salaries and so on and so forth. So, Mr. Chatterjee actually touched upon an interesting issue, which is the idea of state capacity, and he mentioned about the lack of planning capacity within the SRA. And I wonder if, what are your views, Mr. Chatterjee, on the implementation aspects of the MTA? You also mentioned that some of the previous laws were badly implemented. And how would you go about building capacity for implementation of the model tenancy law?
So, in addition to what Sahil mentioned, which actually touches upon the issues, the problems that were faced, especially by the vulnerable population when we were hit by the pandemic, that certainly are things which need to be brought in when the MTA gets adopted by the respective state governments. But I have some more points to actually look at in the MTA. Obviously, the MTA is a Model Tenancy Act of the central government, and it has to be adopted by the state government, and then only it becomes implementable in the state. So one has to see how the Maharashtra government looks at this model act along with the existing 1990 Act, which had major problems to retain some of the very restrictive conditions that were retained because of the interest of the South Mumbai 19,000 dilapidated cess buildings. So, if I have to accept what Durga Shankar Mishra, the Secretary Government of India, says, that even if MTA has to be adopted, this will be only prospective in nature. So that in no case is going to disturb the existing situation which is there for these 16 to 19,000 buildings of the old chawls, tenanted buildings, where the Pagdi system operates under the 1999 Act. So that we will deal separately as to how do you deal with those 19,000 buildings, because every year during the monsoon buildings fall, people die. So the present policy of the government of redevelopment of those buildings on ownership basis is not solving the problem. But then I think that's a separate discussion altogether. Coming back to this point of if and when the state government, Maharashtra government adopts the Model Tenancy Act, some of the things that today, if I have to go through some of the clauses of the Model Tenancy Act, the preamble is very good to say that it will regulate renting of premises and protect both interests of landlord and tenants, and provide a quasi-judicial speedy adjudication mechanism. Now, if I have to go into the definition of a premises and to say that this will apply only to premises, and also go to section 3, which actually says that the act will not apply to certain premises, then we will see that this will leave out a large majority of renting arrangements which are there today in the informal settlements. Because those premises where these people, the vulnerable population, stayed and who were very badly hit during the pandemic, they will be left out of this because they are in informal settlements, and they will not be counted as premises because they are not legal premises. 1. 2. The only affordable rental, formal rental accommodation that gets available in Mumbai is, which are those 2 lakh plus rehabilitation tenements which have got constructed under the SRA scheme, where the slum dwellers who got rehabilitation in those tenements maybe have an extra tenement or maybe part of the tenement they are renting out. But though the act says that for 10 years you can neither sell those tenements nor you can rent them out. So again, it actually is illegally done, but then that is what is providing solace to many large number of people who are going and staying in these rehabilitation tenements. They will also not get counted in the definition of premises because legally speaking, you are not supposed to rent them out. So actually, the exemption clause is taking away whole lot of these tenements, which in fact need to be regulated to see that people can get into those tenements and don't get thrown out at the whims and mercy of the slumlord or maybe the owner. Second thing is, the section 3.2 says that the act will apply only when the owner and tenant both agree that the tenancy agreement entered into between them should be regulated under the act, which means to say that if the tenant and landlord or either of them say that no, let's keep it this way, Or if you would insist, if one of them insists that no, let us go and get this tenancy agreement done in written form and get it registered with the rent authority, and the other person does not agree, then he may not actually give out his premises on rent. So the exemption to take out those tenements, so it is unlike the RERA Act, where every building that a private developer constructs which is meant for sale is supposed to be registered under the RERA Act. This takes out such tenements where the landlord and tenant do not agree to come forward and get it registered. This is my understanding of the act. One may correct me if I am reading it wrong. Then, of course, it goes on to say that it will apply Section 4, and then there are these a digital platform to be put in place within 3 months, which again, point was that when 2016-17, the RERA Act came, and it said that within 1 year you should put up a digital platform, and Maharashtra was in the forefront to put up this digital platform, and it worked very fine. And when you put up a digital platform, even if suppose the Model Tenancy Act requires that you should have the quasi-judicial setup in every district level, the registration part, because there are two different aspects of the act. One is registering of the agreement of the rent. And the second part is the implementation of any violation in that to go to either the rent authority or the three-tier body, the rent authority, the rent court, or the rent tribunal. I feel here the Maharashtra government, it will do good if suppose they use the whole digital platform that has been created under the RERA to actually say that instead of burdening the district collector, district magistrate, who would then find some deputy collector or additional collector or someone or a district judge to man those three-tier bodies of the authority, the rent court and the rent tribunal, I thought it could have been best done if suppose you had said that the Maharashtra RERA, or the RERA for that matter in other places, would actually use its delegated powers to create these type of bodies, and that digital platform created in the RERA would be used for the registration of the tenancy agreements, where the RERA would actually create the rent authorities too, which will have the delegated powers of the RERA. So when you create a body which is supposed to be a regulatory body under the real estate sector, now it does not solve my thinking problem that why should you have maybe a separate authority to be created for the affordable rental housing scheme, a third authority to be created for the Tenancy Act. Why could you not have the regulator called the RERA who will go into this and also will create these sort of bodies at the district level which will be working as the rent courts or the rent tribunals? So these are some of the points which I feel, because otherwise the implementation problem will be huge. Maharashtra, to ask the collectors who will not get extra staff for doing this job of the rent authority, the deputy collectors who are already burdened with whole lot of work, will have to be told that you also do this work. It would do good if suppose Maharashtra government, while adopting the Model Act, takes the help of authority already created and discusses with the Maharashtra RERA authority and takes it forward.
Yeah, I think that makes sense to me. I think the objective of RERA is also to enhance consumer protection in the real estate sector, and therefore, this is also in line with its objectives, really speaking. But now, just to come to the last question, since the title of this podcast is Land of a Billion, what is that one challenge that you would use your time and energy to tackle to secure tenure rights for the billion plus population in India? Let's begin with Sahil. Only one challenge, if you had to tackle, which one would you pick?
I think I would pick making judiciary more efficient in enforcing contracts, because you don't have property without being able to protect yourself from expropriation.
Okay, that's interesting. What about Mr. Chatterjee? What would Mr. Chatterjee pick?
I would feel that effective implementation at the required scale, scaling up the implementation of the very progressive policies that you have.
Okay, so courts and state capacity pretty much summarizes every single problem in India. But okay, good. I hope we can at least tackle a part of it. Thank you both very much. I think it was a great conversation. All disagreements, lack of consensus views are welcome. So thank you for your time today.
Thank you, Bhargavi.
No, thank you so much, Bhargavi and Mr. Chatterjee.
Thank you, Sahil.
Thanks for tuning in to our podcast, Land of a Billion, produced in association with the Property Rights Research Consortium. Don't forget to catch new episodes every alternate Friday, where I will bring you a rundown on the latest charcha around land and housing in India.
Thanks for listening. Log on to the Quint's website and check out our other podcasts.